Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your patience. As always, a quick disclaimer. The information presented tonight is not to be used as medical information. And please always contact a healthcare provider if and when you have any health concerns or questions about yourself or a family member. And especially tonight, our guest is not a licensed medical provider. So medical questions will not be answered tonight. Later this week, though, we have an IG Therapy Forum, and that will be a good time to ask those IG therapy questions. So again, welcome. Thank you. I'm Kathy Antela, Vice President of Education, and I will be tonight's MC. IDF's mission is to improve the diagnosis, treatment, and quality of life of people affected by primary immunodeficiency through fostering a community empowered by advocacy, education, and research. This means that we are committed to serving you and providing you with the tools and resources needed to be your own best advocate and a champion in the PI community. It's by offering these tools and resources that IDF can fulfill its mission of seeking to ensure that everyone in the U.S. affected by PI has a fully informed understanding of the PI diagnosis that affects them, all available treatment options, the expected standard of care, and all opportunities for connection and support within the PI community. As always, we are so proud of our wonderful sponsors. It is due to their partnerships and contributions that IDF is able to provide programs such as this one and additional services to everyone in the PI community. So a huge thank you to our 2021 sponsors: CSL Behring, Grifols, Takeda, Horizon Therapeutics, Octapharma, Accredo, ADMA Biologics, Bioproducts Laboratory, Farming Healthcare, X4 Pharmaceuticals, Kedrion Biopharma, and Celio Health. Upcoming events, as always, Get Connected groups, which are virtual networking groups, are held throughout the country and throughout the year. So check those out if you would like to get together and meet others in your area and talk about PI. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, the next forum is Thursday night this week. It is all about IG replacement therapy and will be presented by Carla Duff, a member of our Nurse Advisory Committee. So hopefully you can join us for that event. But right now, I would like to introduce our presenter, Amy Efantis. Ms. Efantis is the president and CEO at the Plasma Protein Therapeutics Association, known as PPTA. PPTA works globally to advocate for access to and affordability of therapies for patients and engage in constructive dialogue with regulatory agencies and collaborate with patient advocacy organizations. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Amy Efantis as she presents Plasma, a lifeline to many in the PI community.
Kathy, thank you so much. What a nice introduction. And thank you so much for having me tonight. It's an honor to be with you and with this community. I'm Amy Efantis with PPTA. PPTA is a trade and standard setting organization. We represent the private sector producers of plasma-based and recombinant therapies. Our companies provide more than 80% of the world's need for source plasma and the majority of the world's safe and effective plasma protein therapies. We take an active role in, as Kathy said, many of the activities that she listed, including advocacy, but also pathogen safety and health policy. We are a standard setting organization. So our PPTA's mission is to drive broad and reliable access to high quality plasma protein therapies with a focus on the well-being of patients and plasma donors. And we really spent the better part of last year looking at our strategy and thinking about what our structure should look like. And that involved a lot of effort from our member companies. And we really came up with 3 basic pillars. The first is plasma availability. And of course, that's the raw material that's so critical to our discussion today. Access to therapies and working with groups like IDF to advocate for patient access. And finally, awareness. Because as we'll talk about tonight, and I think everyone is probably already keenly aware, but advancing the plasma ecosystem or getting people to understand the importance of plasma means everything, especially now. So our global or our North America members include a lot of the companies that you've already heard from. So ADMA, Biotest, BPL, CSL, Emergent, Grifols, Kedrion, and Takeda. And then we have a lot of other members who are source and regional and associate members as well. Again, we work with a number of different groups. So this is an example of some of the organizations that we work with. And they're really mostly patient organizations that represent people with treatable and rare diseases. And of course, what we have in common is plasma protein therapies. So I think I would be remiss if we didn't start this discussion by talking about the donors, and because it's the beginning of the journey. Whenever I'm, talking to neighbors or at a party and someone asks me what I do, and I always start by talking about two groups of people, the donors and the patients, and how they're linked together. We call it kind of vein to vein. But understanding the process of donating plasma helps put this into perspective. And some of you may have already seen this video, but I think it's elucidating to the process. I'm a plasma donor myself. I can tell you that for anyone who is a healthy adult and qualifies to donate plasma, we encourage everyone to do it. And the process is fairly simple. So I'm going to play you a short video that talks about this. So hopefully that helped clear up for anyone who has never been to a plasma center to have a better understanding of what's involved and how simple it really is. The first time takes about generally around 2 hours, and then around 90 minutes thereafter for visits that follow. It's a great time for people to read a book or catch up on a Netflix series. So it really is, everyone who is a healthy adult donor has this gift to give. And of course, plasma is rich in many proteins. And the one that most of the people on this call are familiar with are immunoglobulins or antibodies. But these therapies are made to treat individuals who are born either with deficient in certain proteins or are born without them. And that includes things like albumin, which I'll come back to because that's a little more generalized, but alpha-1, so that's used to treat people with alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. And those folks generally are born with like a hereditary COPD or like an emphysema that they're born with, or a C1 esterase inhibitor, which is used to treat hereditary angioedema, which is a kind of disease that causes swelling that can be life-threatening. Clotting factors, so that's people with diseases like hemophilia. And then, of course, you know, the most well-known, not just to this group, but in general, most widely used are immune globulins. Albumin is also used very widely to treat patients with liver disease, but also in trauma centers. It's used to treat people who have been burn victims, organ transplant, et cetera. So plasma is super rich in many things that treat a lot of different patients. And as you heard, I think you can't talk about these therapies without talking about the resource intensity of them. And you heard that in the video where it discussed that someone with primary immune deficiency requires around 130 donations a year to sustain their therapies. That's 900 donations a year for someone with alpha-1. And for patients who rely on plasma therapies to treat hemophilia, that can be well over 1,200 donations a year. This is really not news to anyone on this call, but treating primary immune deficiency, of course, treating deficient or damaged antibodies, there are over 400 primary immune deficiency diseases that cause recurrent infection and illnesses. And of course, there are more than 45,000 people on therapy in the United States. And when we talk about plasma, you really have to talk about the global nature of plasma. So we always say blood is local, blood is collected locally, and it's generally used or transfused locally, whereas plasma undergoes a very sophisticated testing and manufacturing process. So plasma is collected from healthy and committed donors, and then that same plasma might be transported to another place for testing. Then it may go to another continent even for what we call fractionation, or removing those proteins and going through the process, the manufacturing process of being turned into a therapy. From there, its final therapies are inspected and then packaged, labeled, and distributed, and they can go to hospital pharmacies, specialty pharmacies, infusion clinics, physician offices, et cetera. So I mention all of that because that entire journey can take 7 to 12 months. And that's an important data point because unlike pill and tablet drugs, which can be generally manufactured much more quickly, these therapies cannot. So I also want to discuss the numbers, and because I think especially during the pandemic, this is important for us all to recognize the importance of the impact the pandemic has had on plasma collection, but also some other factors that we want to discuss. So if you look at this chart, This is shows you a sort of history of plasma collection numbers in the United States. And you can see, and if I showed you graphs that went back to 2010, you would see very steady year-over-year growth of about 10% a year up to 2019. Now, 2019 is an interesting year for a lot of reasons, not just because it's, the year before the pandemic, but also because it was a year of record plasma collections in the US. And even though we had record plasma collections in the US, patients still in the US, some patients face challenges to access for medicines. So why would that be? We're in a year of record collections. Why are patients facing challenges? So PPTA worked closely with our companies, with patient organizations, and with the Food and Drug Administration to really try to nail down what's happening in the supply chain. Why is this happening? Patients. And there wasn't a silver bullet. It was really, or there wasn't one cause. There were a number of factors, and we all sort of landed on this conclusion that it was a perfect storm of different factors, like patients are living longer. Patients on therapy are living longer. That's great news, but it means that people are using therapy longer. Diagnostic tools are improving and people are being diagnosed earlier. Again, this is a good thing for patients, but it impacts patient clinical need, obviously, is elevated. And then there are other factors like in oncology, for example, immunotherapies are becoming more widely used. And when patients are treated with immunotherapies, they often suffer secondary immune deficiencies and get treated with immune globulin. So there's a number of different factors that sort of came together and created this perfect storm. So here we had this year of record collections, and that was obviously something to celebrate. But then the pandemic happened, and we saw in 2020 a 20% decline in plasma collections in the United States. That's obviously an alarming number. And then you see, I don't want you to get too alarmed by the 2021 numbers because that's only as of May. But we are tracking that very closely. And of course, I think patients watch this carefully. The FDA collects this data and watches it carefully. So what are our companies doing about it? I think this is a really telling graphic because you can see that our companies have really been forward leaning and opening new plasma centers to try to address this need for more plasma. And in fact, even this figure is outdated. We now have over 1,000 plasma centers in the US. Again, that's great news. We need that. But when we really dig into the numbers, we see that the average number of collections per center in 2019 was over 63,000, and that dropped to 46,000 per center in 2020. Again, 2021 is just, that's in progress. But most of that growth was not due to an increase in collections, but rather an increase in the number of centers that exist. And again, if you look at the numbers from 2017, they were roughly equal to what we saw in 2019. So we have a long way to go to get to that recovery. We know that 2021 hasn't seen that significant, the recovery that we would like to have seen. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing about it. All of our companies obviously are spending a lot of resources on raising awareness and really trying to attract plasma donors and bring them back to the centers, those who had left because of the pandemic. I think it's important to see that, or to recognize that the newer data indicate there is an increase over 2020, but there is a policy that was put in place by Customs and Border Protection, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is going to harm that recovery. So the difference in donation from 2019 to 2020 is just over 10 million collections, and the loss, you can see what that loss translates into mathematically. So We know that we were already fighting an uphill battle because of the pandemic, and plasma donors understandably at the beginning of the pandemic didn't want to return and were restricted, even though the Department of Homeland Security deemed plasma donors essential and plasma centers essential and the workforce essential. In spite of that, people were understandably afraid. Centers put in remarkable measures to ensure that donors were safe. Those still exist, but that reticence, we still haven't gotten to that recovery. So we're already fighting this uphill battle. And then in June, Customs and Border Protection announced, they called it a clarification of policy, but they changed a policy that precluded donors from Mexico from crossing the border on legal H-1B and H-2B visas and donating plasma. So was that something new? No, donors had been crossing the border for 15, in some areas 20 years legally. And there are approximately 50 centers on the US-Mexico border in the legal border economic zone. So PPTA, obviously we're interested in what's it going to mean. So we sampled 12 centers from that Texas border zone through an anonymized antitrust compliant filter using a third party. And then we found that there was a precipitous further decline of donations in that sample of those centers. And you can see here, this shows that those centers, you get to June when this policy went into effect, and you can see the dramatic decline. So, in recognizing that decline, it's reasonable to expect, obviously, that other centers experience a similar impact. Those collection declines range anywhere from 20 to 90%, depending on the center. And we believe that this will have a chilling effect on those donors, and many of whom have been donating for years. That even if the policy is repealed, it will be difficult to recover those donors, and because it has instilled fear in use of their visas for crossing to donate. So we were already facing depressed numbers from the COVID situation, even in spite of the fact that DHS had declared them essential. So one large center on the border, which normally collects more than 5,000 donations a week, has decreased to just a couple of hundred, and that was a 94% decline for that center. So this is concerning for us, and we're putting a lot of focus on this. So what have we done to respond? Here's a letter that we wrote to President Biden, but we're engaging with policymakers at the federal level, and even at the state level. IDF has been a great partner to us in this effort, in making this point to policymakers. We've talked to administration officials. And if some of you are wondering, why would an agency, Customs and Border Protection, which is part of Homeland Security, why would they make a decision like this without understanding that it could have negative impact on patients? We ask the same question. And why wouldn't anyone else at that level have stepped in? So we went to the Department of Health and Human Services, and even though it's small consolation, they were unaware of this policy. To that end, we met with the Assistant Secretary for Health and Human Services, Dr. Rachel Levine, and she's been very helpful in working with us to communicate to the Department of Homeland Security about rethinking this policy, but that is an ongoing effort. So in summary, COVID has had and continues to have a severe impact on donations. Industry continues to build centers. We have opened more than 400 centers since 2017. And you can see the states where there's a preponderance of those center openings. The CBP articulation of policy shuts down a number of very large, very efficient centers for no benefit. And that policy has significant deleterious economic impact on those communities, as well as donors and ultimately for patients. So the messages I think I'd like to just leave you with is that plasma is global, that it happens all over the world from collection through finished product and needs to be regarded as a global industry. Most of the world's plasma is collected in the US, and only US plasma is used to treat US patients. So only plasma that's collected inside the US is used for US patients, because that follows obviously the rigors of FDA. US reimbursement rates for IG are usually higher than in Europe and Canada. That's good news for patients here. CMS tracks on its dashboard utilization and reimbursement for all IG brands. That's important. I know Dana is on this call as well, and we do a fly-in every year in Washington where we work with our companies and we advocate for the issues that are important to patients. And I had the pleasure of advocating during that fly-in a couple of years ago with Dana's son, and he very clearly articulated to members of Congress that having all brands available is critical, not just because it's a nice to have, because it's a need to have, and that these are not interchangeable products. So what works for kids who are as genetically close as siblings can be may not use the same therapy. So this is a very important message in advocacy as well. And we're asking you to be an advocate and to tell your story because nobody tells it better. Why is access to IG so important? How has it changed your life? What's the importance of having different brands available and making sure that that decision is one that happens between a doctor and a patient? So you can see we have a lot of assets on our website that are available for you to use if you're interested in your advocacy work, and we encourage you to do that. We use social media channels to get out the messages and encourage you to do the same. Here's some example of some of what we use on Facebook. And we also have a very robust campaign underway called Defy the Odds that we're aiming at 5 pilot states where there's a preponderance of collection centers in the bigger states where there are centers. And we're making a pretty aggressive push to work with our companies. So we're pushing donors to donate, and then our companies are doing the actual pull through with all of their good work. So our call to action is this. We ask that you contact policymakers about the urgent need for plasma donations. I think that's pretty obvious. And that you speak out about ending outdated, misguided regulations like the CBP ban on donors from Mexico that we talked about, that you use your own social media channels to spread the word about the need for plasma, and that anyone, if you're an advocate on this call who is a healthy adult and eligible to donate, please give this gift. It's so important. So that's it. And thank you, Kathy, and thank you to IDF and all of you for allowing me to be with you tonight.
Thank you, Amy. Wonderful information. And now time for the Q&A. And yes, so many of you submitted questions prior to tonight's forum, and those were sent over to Amy. And I think she probably answered a lot of them during her presentation. And now we've received a few more questions through the Q&A box. It says, let's see, let's start with the top one. I attended the recent rare disease program, and that would have been IDF's Rare of the Rare Summit. And there was a discussion about the huge need for plasma. From personal experience, I know how much plasma is used by leukemia and other cancer patients, as well as other disease states, since we are all vying for the same pool of donors. Has there been any thought to working together for a joint program to raise awareness about the donations? And you might have covered that, but just to bring it up one more time.
Well, it's a great point. I mean, I think there are a lot of IDF has a wonderful plasma ambassadors program, and we're so grateful for what IDF is doing. A number of the other patient organizations have these same, and our companies all have these awareness campaigns. I think the idea of bringing all these voices together is a brilliant one. There's these sorts of things are challenging in terms of convening that sort of effort, because you are talking about such disparate interests, but it is the same message. And I think, if there's not one central campaign, making sure that we're leveraging all of the different campaigns that are available. I know that, as I said, when our Defy the Odds program is really focused on 5 pilot states where there are plasma centers. And I think one of the other questions that someone asked that ahead of time, Kathy, that you had shared was that, why aren't there plasma centers all over the country in every big city? And that too is an excellent question. And that's because there are states, frankly, that have laws that make it prohibitive to do business. We're working on that. That's one of our, and in fact, it was an IDF advocate who brought a recent project on Connecticut that we're working on to our attention. So we are working to expand that footprint and make sure that those kinds of Byzantine laws are rolled back so that we can open more centers. And then there are other places where it's just not really, it's really challenging and not feasible, like a state like Alaska or Hawaii, where the population is very disparate. But in those places where we do have a bolus of centers, of donors, et cetera, that's where we've really focused this campaign. And our Defy the Odds campaign is really meant to attract people who haven't traditionally thought about donating plasma, and to understand that they have this gift. And I think the story, when I tell people this story about what it means for someone living with an immune deficiency, or to have a child with an immune deficiency, and what's faced, and that you can go to a plasma center and spend 90 minutes giving this gift. It's a very compelling story. People just don't know about it. And so it's a great question. And it's an impressive, it's an important message for us to be communicating as loudly as possible.
Well, and in that same vein here, we have this information and question. I'm a plasma donation coordinator for the Immune Deficiency Foundation. Thank you for that, the person who submitted this question. In the past, I have gone to donation centers to share my story with staff and donors. I also thank them for the jobs they do and the plasma they donate. Is there anything more I can be doing to increase awareness and to help increase the number of donors?
I think honestly, getting this, using our social channels, it's such an easy, inexpensive way to broadcast this message. And yeah, I agree. Thank you for the work that you're doing too, to the person who posed this question. One of the things, and I know that the company folks who are on this webinar tonight will agree with this. I'm sure that there's nothing more compelling or meaningful to a person who's donating plasma than to have someone come in and tell them why it's important and what it means to them as a patient.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And, Amy, I shared with you before we started tonight, one of my kids has CVID and has received IG therapy for actually over 25 years. And the first visit to a plasma center, seeing the donors, seeing the safeguards that are in place, and the commitment of the staff and the donors, it was just phenomenal. And the Immune Deficiency Foundation does have a Plasma Heroes program, and everybody will be hearing more about that from IDF too as this year goes on and we go into next year. And wouldn't it be great again for our plasma coordinators to be able to actually go into the donation center and tell their story and thank the staff and thank the donors. And, you know, one of the messages that my child and I used to share was, I don't care what you do here. If you are sorting mail, you're collecting plasma, you are cleaning the floors, you are a lifesaver. And thank you for being here. You know, so absolutely anybody involved in this forum tonight, go to the IDF website, take a look at volunteer opportunities, sign up to be a plasma center coordinator, because we need you. And those plasma donors and the staff need to see your face when it's safe for us all to go there again. So thank you for that question. How do we get, here's another question. How do we get those ads about donating plasma, Amy, to use on social media?
We have a number of, you can look at our website. So there's a lot of information available on our website, and you're welcome to help yourself to that. Also, following us on social media, PPTA, we often share these things that you can then reshare, which would be great. Thank you for that in advance. And I think it's also important to mention that the Department of Health and Human Services for years has had this blood awareness campaign, which is great. We need more. I mean, there's blood is in short supply too right now. So blood collection is really important as well. But they have a blood awareness campaign, and we even had legislation drafted that said just add and plasma to this effort. And nothing happened. And then when we met with Dr. Levine, she said, well, we'll just make that happen. And so they're now including plasma in their messages. They could probably use some encouragement to include more messages about plasma, but they're an important voice as well.
Absolutely. Next question. Do you think previous donors are worried that donating plasma will remove their own antibodies against COVID that they made through getting a vaccination and leaving them unprotected? Any thoughts about that?
That's a good question. I mean, it may be a concern. I don't think that, because we saw declines in collections before anyone even was vaccinated, and we've seen a rebound that sort of reflects that post vaccination, most people who are vaccinated post that, we've seen actually an increase, which is a good sign that it's not a huge concern for people. And it certainly does not rob them of their antibodies. You'll reproduce those antibodies, but the IG that they're donated does have SARS-CoV-2 antibodies in it.
Thank you. And let's see here. You talked about increasing plasma donation sites throughout the nation. It's amazing to hear the number of new collection sites that have been started. Sometimes we get questions about from individuals in the PI community asking if they can have a plasma drive, like a blood drive. And I don't know if you talked about that, but if you could just address that, that would be wonderful.
Well, I love that idea. I mean, the spirit of that is just wonderful. And of course, a blood drive is something we've all been to one. It's a lot more challenging with plasma because of the need to freeze plasma right after it's collected. That's really important. And it's difficult to do that in a mobile site. But I think if you live near a collection site, to mobilize donors to go and donate together is a great thing to do. We had a partner for plasma donation effort during International Plasma Awareness Week, where we encouraged people through this campaign I mentioned to buddy up with someone, donate together, and then tag their friends on social media. So I think, even that kind of an effort. Let's get together and do this for our family member or our friend who has PI. Let's go together and in their name and do this.
No, and that would be a wonderful thing to do, to donate in honor of somebody that we know, whether it's a family member or a friend with PI. What an amazing thing to do. So everybody keep your eye open at IDF, through IDF, because something like that might be coming. And I think you addressed this, but this question is here, so I'm going to ask it again. Are we getting antibodies from our own country and region, thinking along the lines of regional illnesses? And yes, you did say that plasma collected here stays here or is infused to individuals with PI here. But if you could just follow up on that for a minute.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's an important question too. So the plasma, the plasma that's collected in the US, and again, I emphasize that it's not about collecting from people in the US. That's important. It's collecting it here because of FDA regulations and that kind of oversight. We already have not just the rigorous FDA standards, but our own standards on top of that our companies adhere to, that makes donor screening very rigorous. So safety is the cornerstone of everything our companies do. And donors are screened very thoroughly. And and I think you heard about the testing. Someone really did a nice job explaining about how the thoroughness of testing. But the regional issue, I find this fascinating. My husband has started keeping bees, and he wants honey that's sourced locally because he thinks it'll be better for our immune system. But I think the donors from Mexico, when we met with Health and Human Services about this issue, one of the officials at Health and Human Services said, donors from Mexico are really valuable donors for a lot of reasons, but not the least of which is that because the sort of standards for vaccination are different in Mexico than they are in the US, generally lower. People from Mexico those donors tend to have higher, for example, measles titers, right? And so they're important donors. So I think that's a really good question. One of the great things about the US is it is a very heterogeneous country. And so when we talk about US plasma collection, it's pretty heterogeneous in terms of the antibodies that are collected, but those donors are really vital.
One of the things the safeguards put in place in these collection centers are totally amazing. And one of the things that I found to be so amazing is that every single donor whose plasma is in a lot, you can trace back from that lot number that we all collect. You get your bottle of immunoglobulin, you pull the lot number off, you track it. But behind the scenes, the company is able to go back with that lot number and knows who every single donor is. That to me is amazing.
But I think the importance of those safety protocols, they're all in place for a reason. And this is, as the industry matured, we all are familiar with what happened in the 80s after HIV, et cetera. And our companies really doubled down on safety. And that's why PPTA has a standards program. And we have two separate programs, QSEAL and IQPP, to create these standards that today are sometimes above and beyond the regulators, but even those that went above and beyond were sometimes adopted by regulators. Mm-hmm. So that's really an important thing for patients to understand.
No, I agree. And I know I was one of those parents when I was told your child has CVID and for the rest of their life, they're going to be receiving this IG therapy, and it's plasma. I was, what? You know, no, what? And asked about immune boosting supplements, and, you know, was sent home with some great answers about why IG therapy would be the life-saving therapy long-term. And today, still, you know, he's doing great, but that explanation of the safeguards in place, and also being able to look and see from PPTA and from other individuals in the PI community that, yes, this is life-saving and it is long-term and it is okay. You're going to be okay. You are going to be able to live, you know, a normal life. I mean, that was key. But then the final piece for me, even though it was like, okay, we're in, was going to that plasma center and seeing the donor's eyes, the staff, and knowing that this is as humanly safe as possible. Let's go. I mean, we already had been going, but on we go.
Yeah.
And we still,
Beautiful.
that question that I asked Amy is still a question that we at IDF get today. How about if I try this or this, or, you know, and it's a great question.
It's an important question to ask, and I'm glad we have an answer that provides patients and the parents of patients with that kind of assurance.
Okay, this is the last question I see right now, and that is, and you've also talked about this, but do you know, we know that there are COVID antibodies in the immunoglobulin at this time. Do we know, how will we know when there is a protective level, or if there ever will be? You know, what kind of research is going on behind the scenes in order to help us figure that out? Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, again, very excellent and timely question. So I discussed this with our medical director. I'm glad you made the caveat at the beginning. My science degree is in political science, so that's as far as it goes. But I can tell you that our companies are monitoring the levels of antibodies. I'm not aware of formal studies that are going on, although they may be. So I can get that. I can look for that information. I can tell you generally, our medical director was very sure that these antibodies are present in lots of IG right now. I cannot speak to what that looks like in terms of what the titer levels are or when that means there's immunity, but I think that's a really good conversation to have with physicians, particularly with immunologists.
You know, and IDF too has been and continues to also, you know, communicate with manufacturers and of course PPTA and researchers. And as soon as, you know, we have information too, we'll be definitely sharing that with our community. You know, and the thing I find is that, I mean, yes, everybody knows this is a very difficult, challenging time for our community. And, you know, the thing is that nobody right now, even those outside the PI community, have been through anything like this. And it really is amazing how quickly things are moving and changing. And we will have answers, but right now it is doing the best we can to provide what we know on a regular basis.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Oh my, Amy, thank you. Thank you to PPTA for the work that you do in the PI community. Totally amazing. And thank you for being a plasma donor, but also for volunteering your time to be here with us tonight. Can't thank you enough for that.
It's a pleasure. It's really an honor. Thank you, Kathy, and thanks for everything that IDF does.
And at this time, I would like to thank those featured sponsors today: CSL Behring, Grifols, Takeda, Octapharma, Farming Healthcare, and X4 Pharmaceuticals. And then the last thing I would like to say to everybody tonight is, honestly, thank you. And look forward to seeing you Thursday. And meanwhile, thank you. Thank you to our sponsors. Thank you, Amy, and everybody who's here tonight. Have a good evening. Take care.